Greetings and welcome back to July's TV. Tonight's video is true crime, and the subject, Aileen Wournos. Aileen Wuornos. Many of you may have heard of Aileen Wuornos from the movie Monster, starring Charlize Theron. But in the real world, this was not a movie. Aileen Wuornos, from the late 1980s through the late 1990s, the bodies of 7 middle-aged white men were discovered along Central Florida. It is said that Wuornos had robbed all of the victims before taking their lives and stealing their cars. The victims: Richard Mallory, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burress, Charles Humphreys, who was notably a retired Air Force major, police chief, and Florida child abuse investigators, whose body was found in a Marion County area on September the 12th, 1990. His body was fully clothed. However, he suffered multiple shots to the head and torso. Humphrey's car was later found in Suwannee County. Peter Seams, 65 years old. Walter Antonio, 62 years old. All of these men, total of 7, lives were taken, and Aileen Lee Carol Wuornos was identified as the individual guilty of these heinous crimes. Wuornos was born February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. She grew up with a very dark childhood, which we'll examine. Her father was a convicted child, and I'll use the initial M. He was convicted shortly after Aileen Wuornos' birth, and it is reported that he took his own life in prison a few years later. Aileen Wuornos' mother abandoned both her and their brother when they were very young, and left them with her parents, Wuornos' grandmother and grandfather. To add insult to injury, it is reported that Wuornos' grandfather regularly beat her, while her grandmother was an alcoholic. At the young age of 11, Wuornos began trading intimate favors for money, beer, and cigarettes. She had her only child at the young age of 14. Neighbors claimed the father was an older adult friend of Wuornos' grandfather. The child, had by Aileen Wournos, was later given up for adoption. Soon after, she began spending more time away from home, either living in the woods, hitchhiking around the country, often under a series of assumed names. She was 14 years old when her family kicked her out of the home. By the early 1980s, after her brother's death from cancer, Aileen Wournos moved to Florida to work as what has been coined the most known job for some women. Women of the night, women on the beat. She frequently was in trouble for this profession. Again, the oldest profession known. And for other crimes she had committed. By 1991, Aileen Wuornos had a record to include felonies and misdemeanors, arrests for illegal possession of weapons, forgery, assault, and robbery. Her associates and members of law enforcement personnel often describe Aileen Wuornos as being erratic and easily angered. Her arrest records frequently noted poor attitude. In 1986, Aileen Wuornos met Tyria Moore at a bar in Daytona Beach, Florida. Shortly thereafter, they began an intense romantic relationship that ended just before Wuornos' final arrest that was recorded in 1991. Wuornos' relationship with Moore was her second relationship with a woman. As a woman of the night, her clients were mainly middle-aged, low to middle-class white men. Together, Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore sold stolen items at Florida pawn shops. During these investigations of the men's lives who were taken by Wuornos, police discovered items belonging to Richard Mallory at a local pawn shop with a receipt showing Wuornos' thumbprint. Police then traced other stolen items from Mallory to Wuornos. A camera from Mallory's automobile found inside a rented warehouse unit, which was opened with a key taken from Wuornos. Wuornos had rented the unit under an alias name. Law enforcement officials traced other items from Mallory's car to people or pawn shops Wuornos had contacted. By 1990, Tyria Moore had become suspicious, if not fully aware, of the activities of Aileen Wournos. Moore moved in with her family in Pennsylvania when Aileen Wuornos was arrested on an outstanding warrant at a biker bar in Harbor Oaks, Florida. Police tracked down Moore and used her to elicit a confession from Wuornos. I will play a few clips, fair use. This is a clip of the area in Florida of which Aileen Wuornos was noted to perform many of her deeds. Next clip, also fair use, is Aileen Wuornos and her confession. And the final clip, you will hear and see her frustration as she has been put on death row at least 4 times. Fair use.
2 more death row sentences, and then I gotta go to Pasco and Dixon for 2 more death row. How many times you gotta kill?
So as you can see, Aileen Wuornos suffered, however, she caused much pain and suffering on the aforementioned victims. In Florida, a defendant convicted of taking the life of another can be punished by death if the murder is found to have been committed under certain circumstances listed in the Florida Penal Code, such as the murder of a police officer or firefighter, that the defendant took the lives of 2 or more, and that the defendant committed taking the lives by hire, or that the taking of the lives was intentionally committed in the course of a kidnapping, burglary, robbery, aggravated intimate assault, or other statutory specified felonies. The subclass of murders falling into these categories is also called capital murder. Wuornos was charged with first-degree murder of Richard Mallory, armed robbery with a weapon or deadly weapon, possession of a weapon by a convicted felon. Prosecutors argued Wuornos qualified for the death penalty based on the charge of taking of these lives committed in the course of a robbery. This was noteworthy. The only taking of life charged against Wuornos that went to trial. The other charges ended with guilty or no contest pleas. Aileen Wournos was found guilty on all counts. After less than 2 hours of jury deliberation, an angry Wuornos shouted, "SOBs, I was intimately assaulted. I hope you get intimately assaulted. Scumbags of America." This outburst likely was fresh in the jurors' minds as they began the sentencing phase the very next day. The state expert's psychologist, Dr. Bernard, testified that Aileen Wuornos suffered from both borderline personality disorder, and that may be traced by her horrible upbringing, what she experienced as a child, what happened to her, and the passing of her younger brother. Her biological parents, their checkered past, which may be hereditary, or perhaps it was a lifestyle she grew to adopt. Dr. Bernard also stated that antisocial personality disorder was also a diagnosis. Although Dr. Bernard agreed with other experts that Wuornos experienced impaired capacity and mental disturbance at the time of the crime, he did conclude that the impairment was not substantial and that the disturbance was not extreme. He also agreed that there was evidence of non-statutorial mitigating evidence, such as Wuornos' mental problems, alcoholism, disturbance, and genetic or environmental deficits. In the penalty phase, the defense introduced evidence about Wuornos' background, which I touched on earlier. Her teenage parents separated months before she was born. Her father, identified as Leo Pittman, moved on to serve time in Kansas and Michigan mental hospitals, and then later committed suicide in prison, where he was serving time for child assault and also kidnapping. Aileen Wuornos' teenage mother, Aileen Wournos, described her older brother, Keith, as crying, unhappy babies. Diane's troubled parents adopted Aileen and Keith after she abandoned them. Wuornos' life with her grandparents was physically and verbally abusive. At the very young age of 6, Aileen Wuornos suffered facial burns and scarring when she and Keith set fires with lighter fluid. Again, this was at the age of 6. After grandmother died, her alcoholic grandfather threatened to take her life and her brother if they were not removed from the home. At the age of 15, Aileen Wuornos became a ward of the court. She soon dropped out of school and began engaging in, as I mentioned earlier, the world's oldest profession, and entered the world of alcohol and drug abuse. At the young age of 21, her brother, Keith, passed away of cancer, and her grandfather committed suicide. So as you can see, her childhood was extremely one no child should have to endure. The jury recommended the death sentence by a vote of 12-0, concluding that 5 aggravating circumstances and only 1 mitigating factor were present in the case of Aileen Wuornos. The mitigating factor, you may wonder, Aileen Wuornos suffered from borderline personality disorder. The judge accepted the jury's recommendation of the sentence of death, and Wuornos was sent to the electric chair on January 31st, 1992. After the trial, it was revealed that Aileen Moore, the woman I mentioned earlier, who she had a relationship, made several book and movie deals selling her story, as did 3 detectives on the case who later resigned. In their defense, the officers maintained they were moved to sell their version of the case by pure intentions, planning to put the money in a victims fund. They later denounced exposure of their scheme as a malicious work of brother officers driven by their jealousy at being cut out of the deal. In November of 1992, Dateline reporter from NBC, Michelle Aileen, discovered Mallory had served 10 years in prison for a violent, intimate assault in another state. After the trial, Wuornos was legally adopted by her new friend, Aileen Wuornos. After Wuornos, as it's been recorded, had a dream where she was told to take care of Aileen Wuornos. March 31st, 1992, Wuornos pleaded no contest in the taking of the life of Richard Humphreys, Troy Burris, David Spears, saying she wanted to, quote, get right with God, end quote. The relationship between Aileen and Aileen was not to last. Wuornos began to suspect that Aileen was there only for the publicity and money. Wuornos told Broomfield in an interview that Aileen and Glazer were telling her ways to take her own life in prison. She suspected that they advised no contest because Glazer was too inexperienced to handle a multiple trial of this magnitude. June 1992, defeated by the loss of one of her trusted friends, which was Aileen Wuornos, Wuornos pleaded guilty to taking the life of Charles Koskinen and received her 5th death sentence. February 1993, she pleaded guilty to the taking of the life of Walter Antonio and again was sentenced to death. During the plea to the court, she held to her statement that Mallory had forced himself upon her. In a rambling statement, Aileen Wuornos said, and I quote, I wanted to confess to you that Richard Mallory did violently assault me, as I've told you, but these others did not. They only began to start to. May 15th, 1993, the judge rendered 3 more death sentences. She made an obscene gesture and muttered, "MF." September 30th, 2002, then Governor Jeb Bush granted a stay of execution and ordered a mental examination to determine whether Wuornos was competent to be executed. Florida law mandates that an inmate cannot be executed unless she understands both why she has been sentenced to death and that execution results in death. An examination by 3 psychiatrists appointed by the state concluded Wuornos was competent to be executed, and the stay was lifted. October the 9th, 2002, Aileen Wournos was executed by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison. In her last statement, Wuornos said, and I quote, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, Big Mothership and all, I'll be back," end quote. She was pronounced at 9:47 a.m. on October the 9th, 2002. Aileen Wuornos was the 10th woman to be executed in the United States since 1976, and the second woman ever to be executed in Florida. Thank you for tuning in to True Crime and the story of Aileen Wuornos. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and I look forward to presenting my next video.